I love watching those real life murder mystery shows, like you find on Dateline or 48 Hours. But I can't help but get sucked in by them. For the first half of the show, I'm completely convinced that the person is guilty. But by the second half of the show, I'm completely convinced that they're innocent. Of course, some of that has to do with editing, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that the evidence is never clear cut. It's always ambiguous. It's always open to interpretation. And that's with an event, a crime that happened just a few years ago. So how can there be any clear-cut evidence for an event that happened 2,000 years ago for Jesus' resurrection? Actually, scripture scholars have found a way. Over the years, they've developed a set of criteria, historical criteria, that can take things recorded in the Gospels and determine which things are very certain, very likely to have happened historically. One of the most powerful of these tools is known as the Criterion of Embarrassment. And what it says is that nobody in the early church, no gospel writer, would ever create something that was embarrassing to them, that was somehow counterproductive to their mission. In fact, the impulse would have been the opposite. It would be to suppress or soften such material. So wherever we find embarrassing material in the Gospels, we can be very certain that it actually happened, that it's historically accurate, that it has to be part of the undeniable historical record. Otherwise, it wouldn't be recorded there. For example, the fact that two of Jesus' closest followers, part of his inner circle of 12, that one, Peter, denied him and the other, Judas, betrayed him, was a complete embarrassment to the early church. That they would both act so shamefully, two of his closest disciples, was something that was a total embarrassment to the early church. And that's why today virtually no scripture scholar denies that that's part of the historical record, that Peter actually did deny Jesus and Judas actually betrayed him. So how does this apply to the resurrection? Well, while there are many ways that this historical criteria applies to certain details and facts about the empty tomb and Jesus' resurrected body, his embodied appearances, I only have time to do one. So let me talk about John 21. In John 21, Jesus appears to his disciples, but when he does, they don't recognize him at first, which is odd. And when they finally do recognize him, John adds a comment about their reaction, which is completely bizarre. He says that even though they've come to recognize it's Jesus, finally see that it's him, that no one dared ask him, "Who are you?" What an odd remark. And what makes it even stranger is the fact that that word ask in Greek doesn't simply mean ask. It's a very rare Greek word, exitazo. And what it really means is to press with their questions, to scrutinize, to examine. To give you a sense of what it's like, imagine that an ET landed on Earth and we had the opportunity to examine it. We want to poke and prod and do experiments in order to figure out what this alien creature was all about, in order to understand what this alien creature was all about. That's essentially what this verse is saying about the disciples' reaction. Instead of falling to their knees in adoring faith, saying, "Oh, this is awesome, Jesus, you're risen from the dead," they want to do a science experiment. They want to poke and prod and examine him to try to figure out what this alien creature is all about. This reaction of the disciples would have been so damaging to the early church. It would have created an element of doubt that would have been completely counterproductive to their mission. People in that day would have heard about this reaction and thought to themselves, well, if his disciples aren't sure that it's him, if they don't recognize him at first and then they want to do an experiment with him once they do recognize him to make sure it's him, then maybe they're mistaken. Maybe they're deluded somehow. Maybe in their grief, overcome with grief, they're seeing things. This reaction of the disciples is so embarrassing that we can know for certain it was their actual reaction. It calls into question the credibility of those first witnesses to the resurrection. And nobody in the early church, no gospel writer, would ever create material like this unless it was part of the undeniable historical reality. But here's the thing. This bizarre reaction of the disciples points to the fact that there was something in Jesus, in his appearance to them, that they could examine. In other words, there was something out there, external, in the real world, a physical body to be examined. And that means that this wasn't all in their heads. It wasn't some kind of hallucination. They weren't seeing a ghost. They weren't deluded somehow. That what they were seeing was a physically embodied Jesus, albeit completely, radically transformed in a glorified body, but they were seeing something physical out there in the real world. So while we may not be able to determine who committed a murder several years ago, we can be very certain that Jesus rose from the dead physically in a transformed but physical body. Not only because of this piece of evidence, which I just gave you, but because there's a ton of other evidence that points in the same direction, that points to the same fact. And if Jesus is risen from the dead, that means that he's the Lord of all. It means that his perfect love reigns. It means that love does conquer all. So do you think that there can be credible, clear-cut evidence for an event that happened 2,000 years ago? Go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. Also, please keep liking the Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and telling your friends about us. Thank you.